presentation too.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for everybody joining us here. We do have people in these three and many different time zones. So I am in the morning here in Brazil, and our panelists, some are in the morning, in the afternoon, and also in the evening, as David is speaking from China, Beijing, China, right now. So we're gonna do like this. We're gonna start with John Douglas, who's in the earliest time zone. Then we're gonna have Teresa speaking from Mexico. Then Kerstin from Sweden. And then Francois from South Africa. And David representing Lancaster, sitting today in Beijing, China. So the idea is to give 10 up to 15 minutes for each panelist, and then we save 10, 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. I'll just briefly introduce each of the panelists before they go on. So first of all, thank you all very much for being generous to share your knowledge with us here, with IFSAM's audience. Thank you, Martin, for putting all the effort to have this panel together, and Elisa for also the support on the organization. So we start with John Douglas, who is Senior Research Fellow and Research Professor of Public Policy and Higher Education at the Center for Studies in Higher Education at University of California, Berkeley. One of his last books is Neo-Nationalism in Universities. And he's also, of course, a researcher on the topic of our panel today. So please, John, thank you very much for being here. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Sergio. Nice to meet everyone online. And my talk will be more on the precarious side, I think, and then maybe if there's opportunities to return back to how one navigates through it. At least, you know, again, my assignment was to speak about the situation in the U.S. So let me see if I can get this working. Okay, so again, my goal here is to look at the U.S. side of the equation. And I just want to say a couple of basic kind of environmental scan of American higher ed. One, just to reiterate, because sometimes this isn't understood internationally, is that the U.S. has no Ministry of Higher Education, right? So the organization and chartering of institutions, which is done at various levels of rigor, is done at the state level. The role of the federal government is student financial aid, which is significant, and the other really significant area is funding academic research, basic research, largely through a number of agencies, not a single one, like the NIH, the National Endowment for Health, National Science Foundation, NASA, Department of Energy. There's a grouping. The NIH is the biggest, but and so there are other aspects, and I'll come to one, which is basically accreditation associations, recognizing them, not actually accrediting, but actually recognizing which agencies, which are non-governmental or accrediting associations, are legit. And this is a pathway for financial aid. You have to be accredited in order to get for your students to have availability of financial aid. Now, the other major trend going on in the US, and of course we see things like this in Japan or in other places where demography is going down and makes a big impact, obviously, on enrollments and programs and all of that. In the United States, a mixed story. There are a lot of states with declining population, like Pennsylvania and Michigan, and these states or other states that have moderate to decent sized growth. California's become more of a moderate kind of growth state. It's the largest state in terms of population and the economy in the U.S. And as they like to tout here, if it wasn't a national economy, it'd be the 5th largest in the world. So there's a lot of trends going on. And what that means is that there's a lot of mergers and consolidation of institutions and also closure. But it tends to be more like small liberal arts colleges. You have to realize, again, that the United States has a great variety of institutional types, from community colleges to small liberal arts colleges, to large research universities, some public, most public, some private. More in the enrollment is in the public side, about 75%. In California, it's even higher. So are in public. Tuition increases. So we've been having budget cuts no matter what, even if you're in a growth state. So there's been a lot of growth and increase in tuition. If on the public side, there are studies that show maybe 85 to 90% of that increase in tuition is due almost directly to cuts from state governments, which are the main providers of funding for the operational side and usually capital side of institutions. There's great variety in that, depending on how research intensive the institution is. So this has been obviously a significant factor, which has also helped to drive up really large amounts of student debt through loan programs that are offered by the federal government, by the private sector. We do have grants through what we call Pell for low income students. So student debt is a big issue in the United States and a big political issue in any presidential campaign plus. But you have to differentiate. There's a lot of kind of generalities about that, but as to who has the debt, if you really look at the large percentage of debt, it's in those who went to the for-profit sector and those who are getting, professional degrees like medical degrees and these sorts. So there's a significant portion of that debt lies in that area, less so in the public sector, but still an important political issue. So another important aspect that relates to our discussion is this ongoing erosion in the trust in higher ed. One is a kind of a drumbeat of, is it worth the cost to go and get a BA and then go into the labor market? Most data shows that it does. That's an average. But there's lots of debate, which is ongoing historically, about the utilitarian usage of higher ed and what jobs students are getting, and more attention about that, and salaries and which disciplines and fields students major in and how that fits in. But there's also this ongoing attack by largely right-wing groups about that the universities and colleges are intolerant and dogmatic environments. There's some element of truth in all of this. It's a gross exaggeration and dangerous, but there are things going on in the academy that we have some blame too in this debate. But this is a populist claim. Another thing that relates to that is recent polling, and it's been going on for a while, shows a real big divide between Republicans and Democrats in how they value higher ed. And one of the latest polls says Republicans believe that higher education has a negative effect on the country. And then there are all these other ways of evaluating that. I think that's a pretty startling figure. Tells you something about the political orientation and the divide in the US. And then, of course, with this horrendous, terrible tragedy in the Middle East that's ongoing and looks like it's expanding, which is very sad. Death and destruction, and it causes a lot of, we've had these demonstrations, and it's unusual because it's student on student, faculty on faculty, different than the 60s, some similarities, but also really different. And this is also added to this kind of sense of universities as intolerant and dogmatic, and people are fighting, and it's not good in every aspect, very sad. So, just to give you another example, the Heritage Foundation, which is a very conservative right-wing group, which has come out with Project 2025, which is a blueprint for Donald Trump, if he comes back into power, has just put out a ranking that shows which colleges are more conservative, or where would you want to send in a conservative family your child to. So that's a new ranking. And then there are issues that are real, but also exaggerated and hard to unpack about the security risk universities, research universities in particular, pose in their various collaborations with Chinese universities and others that are linked with the Chinese military world. So it's a highly charged political environment. We have a lot of lobbying going on with the Hamas Israel Netanyahu war. A lot of donors have tried to pressure universities and been engaged in helping to get rid of certain leaders. You're probably aware of some of those with issues in Columbia and MIT and elsewhere. And another aspect that makes the life difficult and challenging for universities and colleges is these series of very conservative decisions by SCOTUS, that's the Supreme Court of the United States. The affirmative action decision was, I think, not based on historical understanding and precedent, in which universities have the right to, as semi-private corporations, whether it's public or private, to make decisions about admissions. And in the past, the Supreme Court's always deferred to universities with certain parameters, but that changed. And we're seeing a much more aggressive legal side packing of these courts with very conservative people. And then just to add to this, so you understand, the United States is a very litigious society, more so probably than anywhere else, but although other parts of the world are catching up, in which lawsuits are filed for various grievances, including ones that make it to the Supreme Court about affirmative action, but also just other kinds of issues related to the health of students or faculty, or some understanding of a violation of civil rights. So we have that as a really significant aspect. I'll come back to this because it has an impact. That's not the only reason, but there's an impact on the culture of institutions as they try to navigate the future. So related to the issues is this kind of red versus blue state divide. So when you look at those polling and Republicans, well, there really are more red Republican states and more blue Democratic states. Then there are these ones we call purple states, which are between and kind of, figuring out where they're going. There's like, we hope in Arizona is one test for this upcoming presidential election. Will it go blue? Will it go Democratic or Republican? Well, it's always going to be kind of in the middle there. But what we're seeing is a series of attacks, particularly by Republican-led states like Florida or Texas, in which there's interventions on the curriculum, efforts to reboot the governing board, and also a lawsuit now in the before the federal courts that says that the U.S. Department of Education, the federal government, should not have the ability to accredit institutions. So, we have this non-governmental structure. So the federal government is the process for about, I think it's 12 or large associations that accredit, that then have access to financial aid. Now, a state like Florida, has a lawsuit that says, no, the federal government doesn't have that right. I want it at the state of in Florida, So Ron DeSantis, the governor there, sees an opening in order to really add another major layer of control by Republicans in that state, that it's very conservative and interventionist. So there's this kind of divide between the blue and red states. Blue states tend to be, like a California, much more supportive generally of the autonomy of institutions, these kinds of things. Then just to add, I don't have an answer to this because we're all debating it, and maybe there'll be other discussions on this, is this AI. What's the role of AI in the future of teaching? And I think we could say there are going to be differentiations of potential impact. At the moment, it's still kind of in gestation. We're just learning. So I got to keep going here. So, why is it not working? Oh, there we go. Yeah. Okay. So only a couple more slides. So that's the world as it exists right now. Now, this is something I've been writing on, and it relates to a book that I was the lead author on, which is called Neo-Nationalism in Universities. So I have that perspective of evaluating Trump's first term. There are many studies in there, Brazil, China, that we have case studies, and then I do the synthesis of what it might mean in the world with these case studies. There are many case studies that could be done. There are too many to put in a single book. But what might a second Trump administration mean? Well, very briefly, besides these kind of very large worries about democracy, or related to that, I should say, is something that's being promoted by conservatives that's called the executive unitary theory. And what that is a fancy name to saying the president of the United States has a lot more power than they've exercised in the past, and it can make all kinds of assumptions as to what they can do, reclassify scientists, federal scientists, for example, or civil servants who work in the area of science and data accumulation. Well, now they're going to be, instead of being civil servants, they'll be political appointees, meaning they could get fired. So there's all kinds of things that relate to this. And added to this is this recent decision by the Supreme Court that says that the president can never, is not criminally liable for whatever they do as president. It's a very strange and upsetting decision, which adds to this authority to basically do whatever he wants, whether legal or in the gray of legal area or illegal. He's has immunity. He or she has immunity. It's a very scary shift in power towards the executive branch. There's this rhetoric that's very much there by Trump and exaggerated, and I just said it before really, but the universities are the enemy, part of the deep state. So what might that mean? Some of the proposals that are floating around through Project 2025, this Heritage Foundation, but also reiterated in various ways by Trump himself, is to basically get rid of the U.S. Department of Ed, take some of the things it does like financial aid and give it mostly to the private sector or in other parts of the government. So this is an ongoing kind of right-wing storyline. Another is to cut student aid itself in terms of both Pell Grants for low-income students, but also other kinds of federal loans that are usually a little below market rate in financial aid. Large cuts to the NSF, NIH, Department of Energy, and get rid of the National Endowment for the Humanities, which is very small budget, but it's all symbolic. There are no clear, he doesn't have a clear policy related to that, except for that he tried to do this every year in his first administration. He failed because he couldn't get support in Congress, but that dynamic could change. Under the executive unitary theory, he could withhold and impound funds they state allocated by the legislature to the NSF, for example, and just say, no, I don't want any funds to go to climate research. So there's a scary world related to that. Could be very significant hit on science, but also on the funding for higher and research universities, which are highly dependent on federal funds. And not just for research, also for funding graduate students. Limit access to federal science data, as I noted before, end the system of federal higher ed accreditation and give it to the states, which is very scary. The use of the Department of Justice to attack universities and academics for various perceived violations. He's openly said that he will use the Department of Justice to go after enemies, but also target entities that he doesn't feel are supportive of the MAGA agenda. And then, of course, there's this isolationist policies that hinder talent mobility that we saw in the first administration, but really could go up. And one of them is H-1B visas, I should add a B in there, which are an important part of attracting graduate students. Graduate students can come to the U.S. from internationally. We need that talent to keep our economy going and our tech and innovation. And right now there's there's actually an unlimited number. You can have H-1B visas for US universities, but also for the tech industry anyway, I'm a little complicated here, but we could see some significant changes in visas and the ability to bring in talented graduate students or even faculty. So why is this not working? Okay, so I just want to note again that what I've portrayed here, and I hope that scholarship in higher ed will think more about, is what I call a political determinist viewpoint. Is something I put forth in the book and on neo-nationalism in the university, and that is we need to pay more attention about what is the political and cultural milieu in which universities operate, and then how important and significant they are in shaping what a university does in the United States, in Brazil under Bolsonaro's, and now Lula, or in China, and that this is an area that has not been, I think, explored and thought about by higher ed scholars as much as we should be paying attention to and evolving our thoughts and, and understanding around it. Then the other thing I just want to again reiterate is this concept that there are a lot of different institutional types in the United States. So, in trying to answer the question about the precarious future, it's different for a community college with a 2-year degree program, which you can see is about, you can see it's about 40%. I think it's a little higher. This is a little old, this data. Students are in community colleges. They're not in big research universities. So you have to differentiate some. What I hear, my final slide is just, well, almost final slide, is to say that, okay, I'm going to talk about, well, what's the impact or what's the environment that research intensive universities are facing. And it's a little different than, say, a community college. And, if you look at the research intensive universities, they enroll around 20%, maybe a little less of the total enrollment in the United States because we have so many different institutional types. But the publics play the biggest role. And I know we think about MIT and Harvard, but if you look at the big publics, state universities like Michigan or Minnesota or the University of California system, they're the biggest player in terms of research productivity and graduate students in engineering. And then the other thing to know, which I didn't say in the beginning, was that most universities are in multi-campus systems. So there are other kinds of dynamics that relate to how they're governed and what the milieu is like for them. So faculty culture, yes, as I think was noted in a previous outline in the announcement of this session, increasing student to faculty ratios, which are having a significant effect on the milieu of the institution, relates almost directly to decreases in public funding, increasing time on faculty, increasing demands on faculty time, obviously to produce original research, and the dynamics and funding for that vary significantly between the disciplines. In some states, there's a tax, particularly in red states, or a tax on the future of tenure, to go to short-term contracts. Again, AI, I don't know. Student culture, I think we're still dealing with the shock of COVID, and particularly in these research universities, so we have residential, students are living on campus or nearby, they're not living at home. Social media, mental health issues are significantly up in the from the COVID, post-COVID area. We have data on that. There's a lot of growth in student services over time, which changes the nature and budgeting of institutions. And then one other element that's now coming into play here in the US is student unionization movement. So graduate students are unionizing, that, and also some institutions, undergraduates are unionizing for work if they're working on campus. And that's driving, there are a lot of good reasons for that, but it's also driving up costs significantly. So one of the issues that relate to this neoliberal organizational world is, there are various ways to unpack it, but I would call it basically looking for ways to cut operational costs and increase funding revenue sources. And that has a huge internal impact on institutions, dealing with it all the time. New taxes internally on projects you're doing, these kinds of things. Looking outside for more money, of course. The key is diversifying income sources if you can. And so, intellectual property, all kinds of different ways of looking at that. Perhaps we'll return to that. And then there are also growing demands by government, to various regulatory structures related to civil rights or other kinds of things. All of this is adding towards larger bureaucratic entities. We're still growing in staff, it appears, sometimes compared to faculty. Academic research, though, is also probably as big a driver as that as possible. Now we're in the world of very large research teams, big support structures for large research projects in the STEM fields. So that's also a driver of staff and bureaucracy. As I said, there's also this internal culture of a risk assessment. So we're constantly being, as a faculty member, having to deal with various issues of risk assessment. For example, constantly, I don't know how many training sessions I have to do on this or that in order to avoid bias or to avoid legal exposure to the university in a process of hiring somebody or all kinds of things. But those are the smaller parts. There's just kind of an overall culture of risk assessment in which legal teams are involved in, legal counsel are involved in shaping these kinds of things. And then get back to the campus culture issues. So I kind of paint this not so great precarious world. I'm sure you'll hear some similar ones from our other colleagues here, and then paths through it. Maybe that's a discussion area. It's not easy to unpack. I just end with this to tell you again what kind of milieu we're in here in the United States. This is from J.D. Vance, who is the vice president candidate. He gave a speech in which Trump was very supportive, called "Universities Are the Enemy." And that was the actual name of the speech before a conservative Republican convention. And with this quote, "If any of us want to do things that we want to do for our country and for our people who live in it, we have to honestly and aggressively attack the universities in this country." That's the kind of language that's acceptable. So anyway, thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to hearing from our other colleagues.
Thank you very much, John. And we just went over 20 minutes, so I kindly ask the next panelists to try to stick to up to 15 minutes. So I'll pass immediately the word on to Teresa, who is representing our association from Mexico, Acacia. Teresa is a full-time professor and researcher at Autonomous University of State of San Hidalgo, the Monterrey Institute of Technology. So please, Teresa, go ahead. The floor is yours.
Hello, thank you for all to say with us. When I was listening, John, I was wondering if the United States have a lot of problems and troubles and challenges to facing. What about for Mexico? It's so difficult for an emergency country facing a lot of social challenges and deal with not enough budget for education. No? Maybe it's a lot of troubles for us. Well, I want to present you briefly a diagnosis of the situation in Mexico about the higher education. Higher education in Mexico faces various challenges affecting its quality and accessibility. These challenges significantly impact the country's social and economic development. Demographic change, the knowledge economy, and the new disruptive technologies of the 21st century and the fourth industrial revolution have led us to consider that we are experiencing a paradigm shift in higher education. In this sense, the central premise of this proposal is straightforward. There will be neither social nor economic development, much less total equality and democracy, if we do not place higher education at the center of national priorities. According to the fifth government report, 2022-2023, educational coverage in Mexico at the higher education level is 43.5%, considerably lower than the average for Latin America, which reached 54%. Despite the growth in enrollment in recent years, Mexico has low coverage in higher education. Despite the size of its economy, despite the efforts of the federal government on the higher education, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, coverage at this educational level has lost momentum in recent years, as we can see in this graphic. The sustained pace of enrollment growth was affected mainly due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and the impact was greater in the public sector, particularly in the technology subsystem. In the 2022 and 2023 school year, total enrollment at the higher education level, which reached 5 million students, with 37% in private institutions and 63% in public institutions, and 29.7% of young people between 18 and 22 years studying higher education. Sorry. 14 bachelor's degree programs comprise about 48% of higher education enrollment, generating an over-concentration. Even though the educational offer in Mexico is extensive and can be grouped into 118 programs, little has changed in the choice of young people. The most popular degree programs have remained the same over the years and without greater variety in different states. Industrial engineering prevails in the north of the country, while law predominates in the lowlands and southwest. Business administration remains in the most studied career in other states, such as Veracruz and Sinaloa. In addition, the choice between women and men is not similar. Although more women are studying higher education today, women study a smaller variety of programs and careers that are less valued by the labor market. While women study administration, law, nursing, and business, men opt for industrial and electronic engineering, software development, and law. In this context, promoting a more informed choice among young people is crucial not only to meet the demands of the labor market, but also to improve the profitability of their decisions, since not all careers offer the same economic of employment opportunities. Therefore, it is advisable to promote more understanding, balance, and diversification in enrollment, as well as to create innovative options and increase training in strategic areas that respond to the social and productivity needs to the country. More young students must understand the benefits of continuing their education and choose a college degree that best suits their needs and abilities. According to McKinsey, advances in automation are anticipated to increase the demand for highly skilled workers with technological, socio-emotional, and cognitive skills. The accelerated emergence of generative artificial intelligence is driving and accelerating the transformation of the workforce and will also impact ways of learning and teaching. While the skills related to AI and new technologies are considered to be of the future, the reality is that they are increasing in demand. For Mexican workers, according to the World Economic Forum, it is estimated that 43% of the basic skills demanded by employers will change in the next 5 years. The skills in high demand in 2015 differed considerably from those required in 2023. And new skills needed in the labor market are expected to emerge by 2027. These skills will be increasing as specialized and technical strength in higher education is crucial. In Mexico, strategies will be required to retain the students, increase enrollment of young people in upper secondary and higher education, diversify the academic programs offered, and rethink their curriculum. Careers related to science, technology, engineering, and mathematics will be fundamental to the education of the next generation. However, in Mexico, only 3 out of every 10 people with bachelor's degree have studied STEM-related careers. Even though these professions offer better job opportunities and more competitive salaries, many young people do not consider them priority options. In 2022, Mexican University could receive 4,000 students in STEM careers. However, 37% of the vacancies offered went unused. To foster talent in STEM areas, improving young people's basic skills and raising educational and learning levels in general is essential. My opinion about what we have to improve in higher education institutions focus in different ways. The first of all is strength hard skills. All the higher education have to offer certifications to take advantage in opportunities to attract new businesses. Involve higher education institutions in conjunction with authorities, promoting programs and certifications that validate the specific skills required by emerging industries. Employability can be enhanced by providing workers and students with appropriate training and certification in areas such as information technology, digital skills, data analytics, and other technical competence. The second one is promote technical careers among young people as a profitable alternative. The specialized skills developed in technical careers will be essential for the labor market. Yet, less than 10% of young people opt for these programs upon graduation from high school. Technical careers are becoming an alternative that requires less economic and time investment, and this diversifies the workforce and meets the demands of the evolving industrial sector. The third one is strength vocational guidance through the school and extracurricular programs in alliance with employers that provide information and experience to young people. The next one is to make our alliance between educational institutions and economic sectors to link talent, supply, and demand effectively. Another topic it's so important to say is it's a concern about generate public and updated information on the employability of each program. The young people don't know these topics and they decide thinking about their dreams. Another one topic that we consider it's so important for enforce the higher education in Mexico is to develop strong fundamental skills in science, math, and reading. As you know, the PISA test said that Mexico are in the lower level amount of the OECD countries. So we have to make public policies that enforce these important areas. We have another problem that concern about the retention in the higher education. We think that we have to strengthen effective retention strategies at all school levels and support and mentoring programs to ensure that all the young people have access to quality education and the opportunities necessary to develop their potential. Another so important topic that we have to enforce is the teacher training. Mexico have to develop public policies about investing adequate in educational resources in teacher training to improve the quality of teaching is essential. Another crucial topic is concerned about to increase and optimize public budget investment to achieve substantial improvements in educational quality. The development of basic skills need to the students and to strengthen the higher education in Mexico. So, as we see, we have the same topics, maybe like US, but it's are deeper in Mexico. The quality of higher education varies considerably among institutions. Many universities face infrastructure problems, lack of resources, and need a quality trained teaching staff. It affects students' education and abilities to compete in the globalized labor market. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Teresa. And I will immediately pass the floor on to Kerstin Saling. Thank you very much for being with us here today. Kerstin.
Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yes, so Kerstin is a senior professor of public management in Department of Business Studies at Uppsala. And thank you very much for being with us here today.
Thank you so much. Well, I will return to what the university is and what we can do from within, so to speak, in this troublesome time. So, of course, the university, we find the contested terrain, as we have heard about now, for the universities. And we have heard about the declining academic freedom, intensified political control. We have heard about closed down scientific fields, or even the sort of idea of closing down the whole operation. And this relates very much to alternative facts and question sciences. But also in our part of the world, where we don't see that drastic changes, maybe we also have a lot of discussion on how there is an increased pressure on a direct societal impact of research. So curiosity-driven research, more basic research, more critical research is sort of not seen as legitimate from all sides anymore, but it's a mission-driven research becomes much more popular. And but we also have, as an organization, I'm an organization theorist, so we have also university leadership crisis, we have more administration, we have new metrics of success, and we have an expansion, as we heard, of new types of universities. And we also have questions from within on how do we assess and evaluate research? Can we trust the peer review, and can we trust the publications? So with this changed political control, the changed organizing and governance, and an erosion of the authority of science and authority of faculty, where do the universities end up in all this? And I will, I name this as an institutional ambiguity of universities. What can they do in this situation? And let's see, why didn't it work now? So, okay, and I just talked about, and I will do this very briefly, talked about the changing organizing and governance, where universities as organizations are increasingly sort of thought of and governed as any kind of organization. And we see this as a general trend in the organizational landscape, that organization, regardless of what their mission and their task is, they are organized in similar ways. John Mayer and Patricia Bromley named this hyper-organization. There is a global organizational blueprint, and the corporate form is sort of developed and spread all across. And we find these reorganized universities, and we have seen these trends under the labels of new public management, of new policies, new markets, new planning and administration, etc. For a long time in my career, I started to study all these depressing and bad things, not as drastic, because they were not as drastic at the time that John talked about, but I mean the sort of what was sort of threatening this, the traditional and the ideal university, as many of us would like to see it. Then I sort of switched over and thought, wait, maybe we can study what is really working and how could that work better. And then I go back to a very old quote here and think about what is really a university, what is unique with the university. And I think that the governance discussion has taken on a sort of an idea on its own. And then I talk about organization and governance in the very sort of local way, the way the organization is set up and governed. Not the political control of it on a more general level that John talked about. So we can find a very old citation here from Immanuel Kant in the late 1700s, where it says, whoever it was that first hit on the notion of a university, it was a good idea, and for every branch of the sciences, there would be a public teacher or a professor appointed as its trustee, a learned community. And that learned community, in order to work, should have a certain autonomy, since, and here in the parentheses is maybe the most important of all in this citation, since only scholars can pass judgment on scholars as such. It's really a call for faculty authority. And just to take another quote from a much more recent publication that I also think we should be reminded of, is that science and scientific operation is sort of a cooperative endeavor. We are searching for knowledge and for spreading knowledge that is a common good that we really do together. And so we talk a lot about competition, and all our meritocratic systems are largely built on competition. And of course, science is a lot about competition, but it is also about cooperation. And where does that take me? That takes me to collegiality. And collegiality as a modus operandi of universities, and as a form of governance that is unique to university. And we have found that there is collegial governance still in many settings, and what can we do to strengthen it? So the definition mostly used for collegiality is the definition by Waters from 1989, an organization that builds on scientific knowledge and for scientific knowledge, where authority is based on expertise, and where we need all sort of to agree from all specializations, and where the collegiate organization is controlled by its faculty. So it's a system of self-controlling and self-policing. So for collegial governance, the focus is on knowledge and scientific quality, independence and integrity, and checks and balances, and where science is in the driver's seat. Very far from the picture we got from John in the beginning here. But maybe there are at least some remains that we can build on, and we should build on, I think. So we've set up an international comparative project in 2019, including scholars from 12 countries, 6 continents, and we did thematic comparisons of contemporary reforms, governance, procedures, practices, reform histories, and how collegiality was understood and practiced and challenged, but also revitalized and revised across the world. And last year we gave out these 2 collections, a special issue of Research in the Sociology of Organizations. And François, who will speak after me, is one of the authors. That's why we had a discussion in the beginning, what we were going to talk about. And let me just take you through some of these. We've found that this definition of collegiality that is much used is still rather abstract and general. So in order to understand what was happening around in the universities and in the academic society, we distinguish between, on the one hand, what we call vertical collegiality, how universities are governed and to what extent they are governed by their faculty. How much do faculty have the initiative and the decision power in appointing professors, in setting up curricula, in recruiting, and etc., etc. But then we have what may be even more taken for granted in many circles, what we call the horizontal collegiality, the communities of peers in departments, in universities, in national system, but also internationally. Those peers that we mobilize when we assess, when we evaluate, in peer review, when we publish, when we try to prioritize when it comes to funding, etc. So we are arguing for the need to really make this visible and really discuss how much does this work, how does it work in different settings. And we of course find that this self-governance, this faculty authority is eroded and it's challenged all over. We have talked about political control. I've talked about hyper-organizations. Of course, new roles and tasks for universities, multiversities, if you like. And a lot of people around the world have very short time frames and insecure positions, which means that they cannot take the time to engage in collegial work. We have changed norms, practices. I just mentioned this overemphasis of competition and less emphasis of collaboration. But still, we think that collegiality is the modus operandi of universities. And if collegiality is challenged, we also have the challenge of scientific knowledge as a basis for the democratic society. So I was already saying that the universities have, of course, a lot of different tasks, but what we are now talking about is this really autonomous university that is aiming at developing and spreading knowledge. And we see in our studies that the collegiality was challenged everywhere, but it was not totally absent anywhere. So both vertical and horizontal collegiality were at least to some extent found in all our countries that we studied, and in some cases even revitalized. And how can we revitalize then the collegiality? A first step, I think, is what we try to do in this publication, is to clarify what is collegiality and make it explicit as a system of governance. And really see to it that we need all aspects that I have tried to rush through here of collegiality to be in place, a formal organizational structure, regulations, so to secure faculty authority, not least within the university, but also norms, that we really have norms that sort of that that we are on a common route to sort of increasing knowledge, that we have the norms that you do this because you think it is important. You do take part in peer review because you think it is important for knowledge to be reviewed, and also a functioning praxis around. And these vertical and horizontal, I've tried to demonstrate how they complement and presuppose each other. And we now see that it's very difficult to find peer reviewers across the world and across. So maybe we really need to talk about how do we get people to take part in the horizontal collegiality, taking on these collegial issues that really makes our whole publication world to work. But that means, of course, that universities are much more than this old-fashioned sort of learned community that I've talked about. So we may need to think about universities much more in terms, if we want to organize and govern internally, to think about the governance mix, that universities can be governed in many different ways at the same time. And maybe we have to make, in Europe, we have much less of a division of tasks across higher education institutions than you have in other parts of the world. Maybe we need more division of tasks. And for individual scholars to make this a system, what we see now is, on top of all these challenges to the collegiality, we see something that we could call a collegial overload. We know how our mailboxes are filled with requests for assessments, for reviews of various kinds. And maybe we should really use our scientific competence where it's best needed. So I try to now talk from the other side, as I may sound very idealistic, but I want to sound that way in this very challenging world we live in. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Kerstin, for the hope you put back on the table. And I'll immediately pass the word on to Francois. Is in the same. So Francois, I have from your website that you're postdoctoral research fellow at Center for Research on Evaluation, Science and Technology at Stellenbosch University. And Francois has been working on South African university system. That's his current research focus: organizational communication of science, society interactions in online communications networks. So thank you very much, Francois, for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Sergio, and for the opportunity to participate. Can you just confirm that you can see my slides and hear me loud and clear?
Yes, it's all fine.
Okay, thank you very much. And I've got a timer going. I'll try and be as quickly as I can so we can make up some time. So, yeah. Kirsten was trying to paint a positive picture. I'm going to be maybe a little bit less positive to restore the balance a bit. And I'm going to focus really on something that's different about our system. So rather than a commonality across systems, there's something that's very peculiar to the system that we work in. And it's going to look a lot at competition rather than on the collaboration side, which is not to say that it doesn't exist. But I want to point out some of what I think are the adverse effects of the competition that is increasing in our own system. But like John did, I'm going to start with a bit of context. I can get the slides to move. So I'm not going to assume that everyone's familiar with the South African higher education landscape. I'm not going to give a very detailed picture, but I think it's important to understand a few things. The one is that there are 26 public universities in South Africa. So it's not a very big system. In fact, it's been fairly tightly controlled by government. It hasn't been allowed to expand, as we'll see on the next slide. But it's also a fairly homogeneous system. We don't have as many types of universities. The government has its own idea that there are 3 types: traditional, comprehensive, and University of Technology, as I've indicated on the slide. But there's increasingly less and less difference between these types. They're really more in the minds of bureaucrats than reflect any kind of reality on the ground. So it's more homogeneous. It is starting to change, and you can see that a little bit in the next slide. This shows the change in the system between 2010 and 2021. And you can see, for example, in the private higher education sector, quite substantial growth. And that's because the government controlled very heavily the private sector post-1994 in the democratic era. But it's also not growing the public sector, public universities. So there's increasing pressure for places, more and more matriculants or school leavers trying to get into the system, but there simply aren't places for them. And so the government is now starting fairly reluctantly to allow private universities to enter into the system, which of course introduces a whole new dynamic in terms of what is offered, what is the quality that is offered, and what is the purpose of those institutions in the broader landscape. But the real point here is to show that the numbers have not increased dramatically over that period. And what's important about that is that we have a fee-paying system. It's not a free system. So it means that universities are unable to increase income from student fees, because those fees are regulated by government, capped after student protests largely, and the enrollment numbers are regulated. So universities' hands are really tied when it comes to generating income from their students. And that means they have to look for funding elsewhere. That's the bottom line for universities. So enter, on that note, the money that is made available by the government for research outputs in this case. And the title of the presentation was Paid to Publish. And that's what happens in South Africa. If you publish in a certain list of accredited journals or approved publishers, you get money. And when I say you, I don't mean the researcher, I mean the university. So the researcher produces the output, and the university is rewarded financially by government in a very clear system, which I'll describe briefly on the next slide. This slide simply shows you that portion accounts for about 14% of government income to universities. Of course, there are other sources of income, third stream income as it's described, etc. But in terms of the block grants, the main pot of funding that comes from government, 14%, is generated through these publications, sort of publication machinery that's been introduced. And it means that universities are very defensive over this money. They're very nervous about losing this 5 billion rand that is allocated throughout the system. So, and because they can't really control any of the other money. I'm going to skip over this slide. Just maybe at the bottom it says, universities are in no position to replace the state subsidy income stream. That's a statement from University South Africa, so the collective of 26 universities, just reiterating the point that this is money that is important and that they cannot lose or afford to lose the source of income. This is how the system works. Best to start with a little green researcher in the middle. The researcher produces a publication. That publication is submitted to an internal structure in the university. Most universities do it differently, but there is some system for internal submission and some quality control that happens as the university then submits to DHET, which is the acronym for the Department of Higher Education and Training, which is the government department. They obviously are funded from the public purse. They look at these publications, and as long as they meet certain criteria, which are fairly generous, to be honest. So as long as your journal is in places like Web of Science, Scopus, even open access journals, Directory of Open Access Journals, you meet the criteria. Once that happens, money is then fed back to the university on the basis that each journal article counts 1 unit. So the pot of money stays the same, and of course, the more applications are, the slice of the pie will change. but 1 unit is roughly equivalent to about $7,500 over the past few years. That's kind of where it's sitting. If you co-publish, you lose money because it's fractional counting. So there's a disincentive to work with your colleagues if you're interested in bringing money to your university. It's far more lucrative to sole author publications. So 1 unit is 1 journal article, but of course there are other types of outputs. So the books can attract up to 10 units, so 10 times a journal article, but also as low as 2 units. And of course it follows the amazing logic of bureaucrats that the longer your book is, the more units you get. So 60 pages gets 2 units and 300 pages gets 10 units. Very easy to measure. And I, as a publisher, love this because then we just increase the type size and the leading and reduce the size of the book and we get to 300 pages. So not really well thought through, but that's the rule. So most people will get 10 units for a book. And then what happens within the university is what I've been looking at. And that's part of my research, is to understand what the universities have been doing with this money that flows back to them. And the short answer is that it varies. There's no one process that all universities follow. Some universities give their academics no incentive. They get nothing in return. The money goes into a pot and you then apply to that pot. So it might go to faculty, and then you say, I want to go to a conference, and then you apply and say, well, can I have support to go to the conference? But others take a very different route and give up to 60% of that money directly to the researcher as salary, as a taxable salary. So those researchers start to depend on this money as income. And that has very dire effects, because if your publication doesn't meet the criteria or is rejected, you lose money. And I've heard officials from DHET say them getting death threats from authors saying, why didn't I get my subsidy? I can't now afford to pay off my car or my house or whatever other debt that I've accumulated. So there's a wide variety of how the universities just disperse the income. In theory, it should be a virtuous cycle, because in theory, the money should go back to the researcher, and then the researcher can use that money again to pay for publication costs, and then they would get money again. That would be ideal, but that's not happening. I mean, a lot of the money is leaking out of the system into the pockets of individual researchers, which was never the intention of the incentive scheme. I'm going to skip over this. This just gives you the detail of what I just said in terms of how it's all calculated. The department then publishes every year how the subsidy has been divided and handed out. So it's fairly transparent. Of course, this is not a ranking, even though it looks like one. You can see universities at the top who have the largest share of publications, all the way down to the ones that have the lowest. And what is interesting for me is to see the change over time, which is hard to show on the slide. But if you take the very top university here, which is UJ, which is the University of Johannesburg, if you look 10 years ago, they were nowhere near the top. So they've been very strategic in how they've been incentivizing their academics to publish in order to attract more subsidy. So they would, for example, send a lot of their staff to conferences, especially when they're virtual conferences, because conference proceedings attract subsidy. What we're seeing now is they're publishing more books because it's worth the effort to get the 10 units. So there's some gaming going on in the background, and this table does matter. To illustrate UCT, which is the University of Cape Town, you can see they're in sixth position. If you follow football or any league, no one wants to be in sixth position. You're not at the top and you're not at the bottom, you're just somewhere in the middle, but you're used to being at the top. They certainly are in most of the global rankings. They'll start to change the narrative. They'll say, well, actually, this doesn't matter so much because this is just measuring numbers. What really matters is quality, and this doesn't tell you anything about quality. So we don't care that we're sixth in the table. So that's the kind of response that we're seeing. This is just normalized for size. It's important because some universities are much smaller, and so they obviously can't compete with the larger universities, but I don't really have time to go into that too much detail. This shows you the actual impact in outputs. So this is a sort of outcome number 2, which is the increase in the number of publications over time. you can see in the beginning up until about 2007, 2008, fairly flat, and then just a constant increase over time. So publication output is constantly increasing. Now you might say, well, there are more staff, so they're the ones are producing more. But if you take it to this slide, you'll see that the number of publications has increased by 13,000, just in raw numbers. But the number of staff has only increased by 5,000. So this is a really good story for a bureaucrat, because these universities have been really efficient. They're producing a lot more with a lot less labor. What this doesn't account for is the invisible labor, or what we would call the precariat, or largely postdocs. So there's a large number of universities that attract postdocs on a bursary, which is tax-free, and they do not they're not staff, they get no benefits, and they're not students, and they're often contracted to publish at least 2 publications a year. So that's a minimum. Sometimes it's more. And a lot of what's hidden here is the output of those sort of emerging and younger academics. And of course, this has several effects, which I don't have time to go into now, but I want to touch on them because of something that John and Kirsten both mentioned. One is it makes it very difficult for this proportion, and we estimate it's about 30 to 40% of the number of authors, to organize, because they're not there for a long time, and they don't know if they're going to be there for a long time. So they don't have the ability to unionize. So their voice is not heard. And the second outcome is the collegial effect. They don't do academic work. They don't become academic citizens. They don't sit on committees. They don't participate in faculty meetings and so on. So they're simply there to publish. And that is driven by this very, very competitive scheme that's been introduced by the government. Again, not so much time. This is just, again, University of Johannesburg, that on their YouTube channel, UJ achieves historic #1 in SA's accredited research outputs. This is one of those moving graphs, and they show over time how they started at the bottom and now they've ended up at the top of the pile. They're very proud of that. This slide is simply a quotation from one of the universities, which shows how they're trying to incentivize individuals, which is not the purpose of the scheme. The scheme is supposed to increase productivity, and the money should go to institutions, and then institutions should use that to develop research culture and support researchers. But that's not what's really happening. It's become an individual endeavor, or individualized. There are also many perverse practices by universities and individuals, and I could do about 3 presentations on this. Publication in predatory journals, salami slicing, editor cartels, all sorts of things that are happening in the background to try and increase the number of publications. So it's all about volume and not about the quality of publications. One interesting one is also the appointment of extraordinary professors. So many people on this call would be invited to join a department, and as long as you put on your publication University of Stellenbosch then gets a portion of the money from that publication, and it sits in your research account. But we have examples of academics publish 120 journals per year, journal articles a year. So, you know, I worked out they probably don't even get Christmas and Easter. They're probably just churning out 2 to 3 journal articles a week. How that's possible, I'm not sure, but that's what we see in the data. This just shows you that sort of the inverse relationship. One would expect, okay, if we pay them more, they'll produce more. So on the left-hand side, you can see the proportion of the subsidy received by the academic, so it's much higher, but the publications aren't necessarily that much higher per academic. As the proportion that goes to the academic goes down, the publications actually increase. So there's an inverse proportion in terms of outputs and incentives, which seems counterintuitive. Just very quickly, this was a very rough and crude table that I did. I was quite curious to see how were the universities that were not paying large amounts of incentives orientating themselves. So how were they positioning themselves in the higher education landscape, both nationally and internationally? And what it shows in a very basic way is that those that have a much more global or international vision of themselves and have a much stronger research focus pay the least to their academics. It's really the ones that are, or what I would call more aspirational, the ones that want to climb up the ladder, that are paying the incentive at a much higher rate. Lastly, this is where I'm at the moment, trying to theorize all of this and trying to work out what's going on. This is work for next year. You know, I was expecting that one would see over a 20-year period some similarity in how universities approach this, but there isn't. Everyone does it differently, so there's no sort of institutionalization of this process, at least. There could be different institutional logics that are encroaching, so market logics, corporate logics, etc., are taking over, and that's maybe a little bit more worrying, especially if that's what's happening at the aspirational universities, that they're starting to behave more like market-like organizations instead of universities, if they're special, as Kirsten alluded to. But maybe there's no institutionalization happening at all, and so this system is not that deeply rooted into the 26 universities, and that could provide some hope for a new system to be introduced to overhaul the current system and weed out the practices that are weakening the institution, and certainly the quality of the research that's being produced. The one challenge, as my last comment, is that, you know, what I expect will happen is that the department will make for much stronger rules about how the money can be dispersed once it gets to the institution, which it doesn't at the moment. But of course, that threatens institutional autonomy. The universities are going to say, we want to have the right to decide how we use the money. And the department is going to say, but universities aren't using it in the way that we said or expected them to. So there's going to be a bit of tension there. It is actually happening at the moment. There's a 5-year project that has started to revise the whole publication subsidy scheme. And I went to one of the first dialogues between universities to discuss this. What is really interesting for me is everyone was talking about the small points. No one was talking about the bigger picture, about quality, simply because they're so scared to lose the subsidy. So they don't want the system to be thrown out. They need the system to remain. They need the money to remain. They just want to make tweaks at the margins to improve the concerns that have arisen around suspect practices. And I will leave it there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Francois, for guiding us into the South African university system. I will immediately pass the floor now to David. Thank you very much, David, for being with us here today. So, brief introduction. David is the academic dean of Lancaster University College, and he's sitting in Beijing right now, so that just clarifies that he's indeed a specialist in transnational education, a leader in higher education on topics as strategic planning, internationalization, and entrepreneurship. So thank you very much, David.
Okay, thank you. I'm just looking to share my screen. It's not coming up at the moment. I think it will do in a moment.
Yes, I saw from everybody else that there was a little delay. Now it's coming on my screen here. Yes, it's on my screen, just not on full screen.
Okay. Right, let's have a go.
But of course, you may start from.
Okay, I don't see it, but I'll talk through it anyway.
Yeah, we can see it. Don't worry.
Okay, great. So I'm going to talk to you very briefly about just transnational education. I guess we're so short of time. I've got about 10 minutes maybe. So my name is David Higgett. I'm the academic dean for Lancaster University. I'm going to give you a more positive spin, mainly because I've been responsible for setting up this organization. So naturally, I'm very proud of what we've done. So here's Lancaster University symbol underneath a Chinese flag. Are my slides moving forward?
Yes.
Yep. Okay, right. I still can't see anything myself. So, okay, here we go. Just I give you an idea about the scale of transnational education. So based on the UK, we have about 600,000 international students in the UK. we have 450,000 offshore studying for UK degrees in transnational education. And that, of course, dwarfs the number of UK students going out overseas. And if we go to China, we can see the data. There's about 500,000 students registered in transnational education in China. About 1.5 million students have already graduated from those programs. And they're either at joint institutes like Lancaster University at Beijing Jiaotong, or in joint programs, which are individual programs. For the UK, we have about 25% share of the Sino-foreign joint institutes and joint programs. There are a couple of foreign universities with legal identity, Nottingham and Liverpool, but after they were established, the Chinese authorities, the Ministry of Education, wanted universities to go into partnership. And unbelievably, there are 44 UK universities that have joint institutes. Okay, if my slides are still moving on, just some background context. I'll go through this very quickly. Why are Chinese universities interested in bringing in foreign partners? A lot of it has to do with financial incentives. So in our case, a new district was being planned by a city. They built a university campus. They needed someone to take it over. So our partner, Beijing Jiaotong, got an incentive to take that campus and then needed to identify international partners. They actually had an interesting vision that they want a kind of United Nations models with lots of different countries represented. The reality is that's quite difficult to do. There's one US program and there's our UK China Joint Institute, which has 8 programs. So why are we here in terms of why would the UK university want to go and settle in China? This is a very positive slide to explain what it's all about from our perspective. So in terms of TNE, it's about harnessing the best aspects of 2 higher education systems. So this oversimplifies and generalizes, but essentially the China higher education system has a very solid quantitative foundation, develops the ability of students to learn. UK system has a reputation for inspiring students to release creative potential. So if you bring those 2 systems together, we would argue it gives you the ability to prepare future leaders with international cross-cultural perspectives, ready to go out in the world to put theory into practice and to be very flexible. It's also not just about students, it's also about creating internationalized faculty. So that means both in terms of the UK staff going out to China and the Chinese staff who work with us in the campus. It offers opportunities for research and knowledge exchange, for enhancement of quality standards and so on. However, there's giving you that positive view, there are, of course, underneath the surface, there are various issues of precarity that we should look on. Because time is short, I'm just going to give you
David, I think you freezed. Can you all hear me?
Yeah, I
Yes,
think
yes,
that
Yeah,
is
we can.
Praise
David.
hear you.
Yeah, I think he's down now. He's in
Maybe
China
can
and he's trying to get back. Hi, David, can you hear us again?
you are muted, David.
okay, right.
Thank
Are you
you.
okay? Can you see the slide still?
No, the
Okay.
slides are down.
The slides are down?
You should share
Yes.
them again, please.
Okay, right. Here we go.
Precarity potential, that's where we lost you. That's exactly there.
Okay, right, yeah, okay.
Perfect.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, using my VPN as well. Okay, So our flying faculty model, there's an issue that staff are kind of neither here nor there. They're not in China for long enough to feel completely part of the system. They're not quite treated as proper faculty when they're back in the UK. There's huge issues around culture shock for people coming out. We're also a very isolated location with limited facilities, and what I might call a skeleton campus, and the idea that we have very few staff. We essentially have enough staff to cover the modules we need to teach. So there's very little backup when somebody falls ill, for example, and it's very complicated in terms of tax and visas. So you put that to one side. Those are common problems in conducting TNE from a supplier point of view. But on the other hand, there's huge potential. So this kind of operation gives early career faculty in particular enhanced responsibilities. There's a lot of entrepreneurial spirit. It really builds up resilience. And to go to something that Kirsten said earlier, I really do think this enhances collegial spirit. There's very few silos, but with a relatively small operation, those boundaries between different departments means that we've got our staff talking to each other, whether they're business management or engineers or computer scientists. That it's much easier to communicate and talk about interdisciplinary problems. It's also quite good, as we've discovered. We have a high turnover of staff, but that's partly because this is a great stepping stone for accelerated promotion. Okay, let's talk on another issue. Is this a neo-colonial model, or is it actually a way of promoting decolonization? Clearly, this is the export of higher education into host countries raises all sorts of concerns about power relations, particularly around quality assurance. The UK partner's responsible for quality assurance. At the beginning, there's a certain amount of mistrust of the host country regulations and practices. And you could also argue that this model is largely about resource extraction, by which I mean tuition fees. If it's done well in the sense of being financially sustainable, it is a good model to subsidize the university back in the UK. However, you can put that to one side and say this is also a case for decolonization in terms of the evolution of the partnership from collaboration, where you throw two universities together, to really moving towards co-creation of ideas, to a co-strategy. And that's something we've just launched. We're 8 years in, and we're just moving towards developing a co-strategy for a shared vision of this institute. Now, I put that colonial slide up, and with a certain amount of irony, we're actually located in an area which was a British leased territory. So look at my beautiful flag with Mandarin ducks. If you ever get asked in a quiz, are there any flags with ducks on it? Way High Way had a flag with ducks on it. But interestingly, the local government is really quite proud of this colonial heritage. Is promoting it. So we live in an area where we're thinking about decolonization, but actually colonial history is quite actively promoted. I'll finish with a slide about drivers for growth. And in the nature of this particular conference session, I think we just posed the question about whether this is an example of ambition and entrepreneurship, or whether we're caught in a kind of neoliberal growth doctrine. So lots of reasons why TNA would continue to expand. We do have a lot of physical space. For example, we have capacity. The reputational dividend from the success of the institute is another incentive to push further. There's all sorts of potential to acquire additional admission quota, so undergraduate students coming towards it, and we're moving on a journey towards research collaboration. So plenty of reasons that we're quite positive about the way that TNE has spun out in this. But of course, we need a critique, and we need to think about where this fits within those arguments about neoliberalism. And I'll finish there. This is Shay, which means thank you. So I hope I've been very quick. And thank you from Beijing.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you all panelists for the presentations. Clearly, we have moved from different perspectives, and took note of institution ambiguity that Kerstin said. Clearly, different parts of the world moving in different directions. So I just put in the chat box the email for IFSAM for anyone willing to send later messages. I'm not sure if we can keep the communication on as we went out of time. Elisa, does the link keeps working further? So we may take up 1 or 2 questions.
We have a few minutes left. If someone has a question to pose to our panelist, it's time to do it.
I took the liberty, Elisa, to put email for the SG.
Great, you did
If
very
some-
well. In case
Oh.
you have some question, you can address them to my email, sg@ifsam.org, and I can send it to Sergio and the panelists. Thank you.
Yes, please. And just if there is no more question coming, just to end on a note from Brazil and from the calling of the panel, I named there a higher education institution from Brazil, named it Vitru, which is probably the largest distance learning higher education in the world, close to 900,000 students. So I got this very morning material fact from the investor relations website that they are not engaging in a merger and acquisitions talk with one of the giant institutions in Brazil. But of course, when, as we say in Portuguese, where there is smoke, there is fire. So maybe soon you're gonna hear about the largest higher education institution in the world in Brazil if there is a merge. Maybe 1.7 million students in a higher education institution. So just to go back to this call for a panel, different shapes and formats of higher education institutions. This is what we are talking about in Brazil now. Large conglomerates head by private equity funds on listed companies driving for distance learning education where they can take out a larger EBITDA. So let's go back to the positive note from Kerstin Salin so that we try to revamp collegiality from whatever is left in our parts of the world and try to build from there. So thank you all for hanging out with us. We will keep in touch, and we hope we can get the image authorization from all panelists so we can put the link for the recording in IFSAM's website, and so that we can share with all our interest networks. So thank you very much for being with us here. Any panelists want to say a last word? Of course, please go ahead.
If I may jump in, I would like to remind to all the attendees that IFSAM has a call for awards that is open, the 2024 awards, 3 awards. If you, your association and colleagues would like to apply, the deadline is November 1st, 2024. Thank you.
Thank you to you for the invitation, and see you soon.
Thank you to all of you. Thanks a lot. Thanks a
Thank you.
lot.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Have a good week.